Hey, class. In this podcast, I want to continue my brief thumbnail sketch of Adolf Hitler that I started at the end of class yesterday. As I said before, Hitler, born in Vienna, had kind of an aimless youth, declared himself an artist. There's actually some Hitler paintings you can find. You can probably see him online. But Hitler really found himself in World War One as a member of the German army. He found a community. He was, sad to say, he was an effective frontline soldier. He was wounded a couple of times, and he had been gassed, and he was actually in the hospital getting treated for being gassed, mustard gas. And when the news of the German surrender reached him, um, he found, like I said before, he found himself in the army, and he plugged into a current of anti-Semitism that was part of the German army. Although many Jews fought bravely for the German army during World War One. Remember, World War One and World War Two radically different. World War One, the anti-Semitism you see in World War One, it's nothing compared to what you see in World War Two. But nonetheless, there was the strain of anti-Semitism that he picked up on, and he was angered by the Treaty of Versailles, as were many Germans. He felt it humiliated Germany, and he went into politics, right-wing nationalist politics, in the years after World War One. Apparently, although it doesn't really translate that well to the 21st century, he was a mesmerizing public speaker, or at least a lot of Germans thought he was a mesmerizing public speaker. He was talking about the things that many Germans, it resonated with many Germans, especially the stab in the back thesis that Germany had been stabbed in the back by internal enemies rather than being defeated by Britain, the US, and France in World War One. That idea resonated with many Germans. His anti-communism resonated with many Germans as well. And I can't remind you enough of how in the pre-war period, or the period between World War One and World War Two, how many people in Europe and the US felt that Stalin or the Soviet Union was really the bigger enemy. Then was Germany, and even after Hitler took over in Germany in 1933, remember the Russians, the Soviets, called on world revolution. They had tried to take advantage of the disorder after World War One to spread their revolution into Western Europe. There was disorder in the United States as well. So Stalin comes in with a platform, at least on paper, of world revolution, although, as Snyder reminds us, by the 1920s, Stalin has decided that the revolution, the world global revolution that the Bolsheviks had called for, was not going to happen. And he adopts a program of socialism in one country, where what he's trying to do is establish the proletariat in the Soviet Union and focus on that. Nonetheless, there's still a lot of rhetoric of world revolution, and a lot of folks are very concerned, scared. They feel like Stalin and the Soviet Union are the great danger that the world faces. So Hitler, he's very political. He creates a party which will develop into the Nazi Party. In 1923, he leads a kind of an inept coup, um, um, and is thrown in jail. And at that point, he sits down and writes his famous book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And what he talks about in that book, he talks about the Volk, the German Volk, the German people. He talks about, which of course didn't include Jews. But remember, Jews are a very tiny percent of Germany. I think Snyder says like less than 1%, around 1%. So it's important to remember that. But nonetheless, Jews were useful as a scapegoat. as well. Remember this formulation that Hitler, of course, is very, very anti-communist, but he sees most communists as being Jews, and he sees most Jews as being communist. To Hitler and his followers, they're really the same thing, and this never changes until he commits suicide in 1945. So in this idea of Volk, individual rights would be sacrificed for the state. And unlike the Soviet Union, in the Nazi state, you don't have the government necessarily taking over capitalist enterprises. What you have and what develops is there's close cooperation between capitalism and the state. The state can direct the capitalist into what it needs, especially when it comes to armaments. But in Russia, you don't have a private sector. This is one of the things that Stalin, with the kulaks and the poor victims of the Ukrainian and the other famines. The idea is to collectivize or to run industries that the state completely controls. You don't have a private market. You don't have capitalism, anything like that in the Soviet Union. So what you have in Germany is different. You have a totalitarian state. You have a police state. You have extra legal murders by the hundreds of thousands. But one of the key differences is the state doesn't completely take over the economy. Instead, in Nazi Germany, there's cooperation between the capitalist sector and the government. Although, of course, the capitalist sector is kept on a pretty tight leash too. It can't do anything that it wants. So Hitler, he gets out of jail, he publishes Mein Kampf, and of course in Mein Kampf he also talks about this idea of Lebensraum, that Germany needs more room, more living space, which of course, as we know, as you should know by now, would definitely include Ukraine and other parts of the western part of the Soviet Union. That Germany's hemmed in, that the borders created after World War I are very unfair to Germany, and that Germany needs to capture more land, especially so it can feed itself. So by the middle of the 1920s, Hitler has created basically his game plan for what he will do when he's in power. And for the most part, it's a game plan that he sticks to pretty closely for the rest of his career. Now, sometimes he'll emphasize some parts of it more than others. Like when he first comes into power, he's more focused on anti-communism than he is on his anti-Semitism, although it's an undercurrent of his speeches always, because again, communist equal Jew, Jew equal a communist. So he's flexible and pragmatic in that way. But overall, these are the goals. This idea of a Volk, a master race, that the non-Jewish Germans, they're a master race destined to rule Europe and maybe even the globe. The idea that their destiny, their utopia, needs to be fulfilled in places like Ukraine, so there can be enough food and natural resources as well in places like the Caucasus. He spells this out in great detail in Mein Kampf. And by the 1920s, once he comes out of jail, he's a little bit more sophisticated in his thinking and in his maneuvering. And he starts kind of his rise to power in Germany, which I'll talk about in the next podcast.